Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We are absolutely delighted to have you all here um, on the internet with us. My name is Annette Reynolds. I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Waltham. And a few months ago, one of our members, Mary Sue, said, gee, it would be really, really nice if we had a program on fake news. And I said, fine, pull it together. And Karen says, well, wait a second. I think I know somebody who can help us. And she reached out to Dan Kennedy, and thank you, Dan, for offering to do that. And we really value your time today. Now,
Thanks for having me.
oh, it's my pleasure. For those of you who don't know, Dan is a nationally known media commentator who writes for WGBHnews.org, the Neiman Journalism Lab, and other publications. He's a regular panelist on Beat the Press. It's an award-winning weekly media roundtable on WGBH TV, that's Channel 2. Professor Kennedy teaches news reporting, media law, and other journalism courses with an emphasis on blogging, multimedia, and social networks. And I am just so delighted to have you here, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me. And this is at Northeastern that she's referring to.
Yes.
But we are out of school. We have been teaching via Zoom since March 11th, like everybody else. And so thank you for coming. I can't see anybody except but I see that there are 40 people here, which is very nice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a PowerPoint up. The nice thing about that is you won't have to look at me. My students always find that to be a bonus, and we will get underway. I really want to talk about fake news in kind of two parts, because what we were talking about a couple of years ago with regard to fake news is different from what we tend to talk about today. So I want to kind of go back to where we were at a few years ago before I bring it up to the present. By the way, I should say that when I was first thinking about this a couple of years ago, I started searching through my notes, and I saw that I had talked about fake news with my students in 2014. And I thought, what the heck was that all about? Because we weren't really talking about fake news back then. At least I didn't think so. And when I called up my notes, I saw that we were talking about Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. So that's a very different type of fake news. Yeah. So what we're going to be looking at today is, let me see if I can get this rolling. Fake news, what it is, what it isn't, and how to avoid it. And I thought I would begin with a brief history of fake news. Now, I'm sure that all of us have been to the supermarket and have at least seen this bat child on the cover of the Weekly World News. And that was an example of, I guess you would say, fake news that most people understood was not real. But historically, there have been a number of what you would call fake news stories that that were intended to get people to believe that they were actually true. I'll go back to the American Revolution and the Boston Massacre. Here you have this wonderful engraving by Paul Revere showing a well-organized line of British soldiers with a commanding officer holding up his sword, gunning down these innocent colonials. And this was a major step in the road to the revolution. Now, believe it or not, I did my master's thesis on the Boston Massacre and the press. And I can tell you that what you're looking at never happened. Um, First of all, in the years before the Boston Massacre, the Patriot forces led by Samuel Adams had forced all of the uh, loyalist publishers to flee Boston, so that by the time the Boston Massacre came about, all of the newspapers were on the side of the Patriots, and they told the story the way they wanted it to be told. In fact, the British soldiers were so badly paid that some of them were working night jobs just to make ends meet. And one night, a few of them were coming home from their second job, and they ran across a drunken gang of colonials who began to make trouble. And the British soldiers actually ended up shooting at them out of fear more than anything. And we all know the famous story of John Adams, Samuel Adams' cousin, defending the British soldiers in court. And in fact, they were acquitted of any crime. But it was a brilliant piece of propaganda that really helped build sentiment toward the revolution. By the way, I want to call your attention to the little dog in front, which is one of the greatest features of this engraving. No one knows what on earth this dog is doing there, but the speculation is that Paul Revere had somehow wrecked the plate, and he added a dog to cover up the flaw in the plate. And I absolutely love that. Now, this brings us up to the 1830s. We're living through an age today where for the last 15 or 20 years, technology has been completely upending the news business. We all know that newspapers have a very tough time of it today because the business of journalism is not anywhere near as lucrative in the digital space as it was when we had printed newspapers. Well, something similar happened in the 1830s. The invention of the steam press enabled the rise of a new breed of cheap daily newspapers that were called the penny press. And one of the very first of these was the New York Sun, sold for a penny. And unlike newspapers up to this point, the publisher of the New York Sun, Benjamin Day, pursued a mass audience of working class people. And what did this new audience want? Well, of course, they wanted to know the latest goings on the moon. And Benjamin Day and the New York Sun, by God, brought that news to them. They ran a series of stories and pictures supposedly depicting life on the moon as seen through the telescope of Sir John Herschel. And you look at something like this and you have to assume that the people who were reading it knew that it wasn't real. But it was certainly highly entertaining. And again, it was another early form of fake news. Now that's just on the entertaining side. But if we get back to something a little bit more serious, like the propaganda around the Boston Massacre, we come up to William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. And some of us were actually talking about this just before we went live, where Hearst was trying to gin up a war with Spain. And the way he was doing this was over the explosion of the USS Maine in the harbor in Cuba. And you see they have this very intricate drawing. I'm pointing to it, but you can't see me point, I realize. And they have all these cables going to shore, and then they've got the, I guess the plunger that makes the dynamite go off, and all of these details. But again, none of it was true. It was a complete fake. In fact, the explosion of the Maine was an accident. But William Randolph Hearst and other yellow publishers of the day, like Joseph Pulitzer, kept pushing and pushing and pushing for war, and they eventually got a war. The story we were talking about before we went live was that Hearst had an illustrator in Cuba, and he just stationed him there and said, "You just wait." And the illustrator was getting sick of waiting around. Nothing was going on, and he cabled Hearst and said, "What should I do?" And Hearst supposedly said to him, "You supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." And he did indeed supply the war. Now, the type of fake news continued right up to more recent times. And, and one good example of this was very early in the presidency of Bill Clinton. Anyone who was working in newspapers at the time that Bill Clinton became president was getting harassed by people who wanted to know why we weren't covering this huge MENA scandal. And MENA, maybe it was pronounced MENA, I don't know. It was an airstrip in western Arkansas. And supposedly, Bill Clinton was allowing the shipment of cocaine into this airstrip in cooperation with the CIA to do something. I don't even remember what. But this was taken as an article of faith among Bill Clinton's many enemies. So you see that even in these days, just before the internet, fake news stories like this advanced. Now, this brings us up to the modern definition of fake news. I first became familiar with what we think of today as fake news during the 2016 presidential campaign. Publications such as the New York Times and BuzzFeed were reporting that there were all of these people putting together literally fake news stories with the idea of going viral and making a little bit of money from Google Ads. The idea was that you'd post the link on Facebook, you'd get people excited, they would click, and then you'd get a little bit of money from Google Ads for doing that. The original motivation was not especially political. I'm showing Pope Francis here. We've all heard the story that there was that the fake news folks put out the word that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. Well, in fact, even before that, there was a story that the Pope had endorsed Hillary Clinton. And that was not getting the degree of clicks and engagement that they were looking for. So they tried Donald Trump. And that seemed to take off. So from that point forward, the fake news content producers basically took then candidate Trump's side because there was more money in it. Believe it or not, a lot of these early fake news content producers were kids in Macedonia. And you'd say, well, how on earth could this happen? Well, it turned out that in Macedonia, the tiny little bit of money that you would make from Google Ads were enough to add up. And so Macedonia became kind of a center of this. This is an actual picture of the hills of Macedonia, and you see some houses there. And if you look inside those windows, you might be able to see a glowing computer and a teenager in front of it putting together fake news stories. Can you see it? Probably not. Examples of fake news. And here's where we end up getting sort of a cross definition from what we had originally thought. Um, I originally thought of fake news as something that was not primarily political, but today you would have to say Alex Jones's InfoWars is a leading example of fake news. And you say, well, he certainly has a political agenda, but at the same time, he's also using his platform to sell products. And another is cbsnews.com.co. And there were a number of these things out there at one time that were made to look like they were legitimate news sites. So cbsnews.com is a legitimate news site. And you add the little .co at the end, and you end up with a deceptive address that takes you to a fake news site. So what do we do about this? Well, as I say here, early efforts have been less than promising. Google and Facebook have tried to deny ad revenue and call them out, but they've had limited success. And the other thing is, the web, the wild web remains completely open. So you take somebody like Alex Jones, who has been deplatformed. He's off Facebook, he's off Instagram, he can't get on anywhere, except that his website is still a very highly trafficked website. And he really has no problem getting his message out, even though his reach is a little bit more restricted than it used to be. Now, I try to make a little bit of a distinction between fake news and false news, although I do feel like the two have started blending together since I first began talking about this. False news is error-riddled or deceptive stories with a political agenda. And here you have President Trump standing in front of the flag of Sweden. And I don't know if you remember what this was all about. But a few years ago, he got the idea that immigrants were causing some sort of violence in Sweden. And he started talking about it on TV. And nobody knew what on earth he was talking about. And it turned out he had gotten it from some very dubious news source, and it really wasn't true. The goal is to persuade and affect public discourse. We're not talking about teenagers in Macedonia. We're talking about people like Steve Bannon, who were putting out weaponized propaganda with the aim of bending reality their way. So what would be some examples of this? Well, Breitbart, of course. Breitbart is not as popular as it was during the 2016 campaign, but it's still very pro-Trump and very influential. I would say much of Fox News, certainly the three primetime hosts, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and Laura Ingraham, loaded with these error-filled and deceptive stories. I did my column for WGBH News recently on, I spent a night watching the three Fox News hosts, and they were putting out all of this dangerous misinformation about COVID-19. And it was really an incredible thing to watch. Now, I have to say, most of this does seem to take place on the right, but there were certainly a number of liberal and democratic leaning projects that are also engaging in deceptive news to try to win you over to their side. I throw Occupy Democrats in there as just one example of that. I would say that if you are liberal, if you are a Democrat, and you engage with political content on Facebook, you probably end up seeing quite a bit of left-leaning propaganda, because Facebook's algorithms know that that's what you like. And so you tend to see more and more of that. What can we do about false news? Well, as I said earlier, the purely fake news done for fun and profit, we can do a little bit about that by denying them their ad money. But false news is a little bit different. I think that this really falls into the discourse that we would expect to encounter in the public square. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. put it well when he said, "The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market." So and another way of putting that is that the best solution to bad speech is more speech. And certainly what's going on today can test our resolve to hold to those principles, but I think that they have stood us well for a very long time. Now we get to, and then we get to a complicating factor. As we know, today, Russia was behind an awful lot of the fake and false news that we've been encountering. And they were much more involved in the 2016 campaign than we knew at the time. It was, again, it was not just the teenagers in Macedonia. It was a rather concerted effort to help then candidate Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton, whether you think that they were actually working directly with the Trump campaign or not, that's certainly what was going on. Russian agents reached 126 million users on Facebook during the campaign, 131,000 messages on Twitter. And you sometimes wonder, did this really matter? Well, one thing that we learned after the campaign was that Hillary Clinton's support among African American voters was not as high as it could have been. And people were wondering, well, why would that be? Certainly Trump was not appealing to the minority vote. He was scaring the minority vote. Well, one of the things that this Russian campaign did was that they got out criticism of the Clinton support for a mid-90s crime bill that was unpopular among African Americans. And the idea was not to convert African American voters from Clinton supporters into Trump supporters. It was to get them to lose interest in the election and stay home. And to some extent, it did work. Now, coming up next is my absolute all-time favorite piece of Russian propaganda that was posted on Facebook. If you haven't seen this before, you will love it. I mean, this was just, you'd say, how could anybody be persuaded by this? It's just so over the top and silly. But, you know, I guess if you are seeing this enough, and if you think that Hillary Clinton is an enemy of your particular religious point of view anyway, I suppose this has some kind of subliminal effect. I don't know. So this brings me finally to what is real news. And, you know, we know what real news is when we see it, but I want to try to define it a little bit. Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel, two veteran journalists, wrote a wonderful book a number of years ago called The Elements of Journalism. And my favorite parts of that, because it makes it very easy to explain it to people, is that they say journalism's first obligation is to the truth, and it's based on a discipline of verification. It doesn't mean that we always get it right. It doesn't mean that we don't make some pretty horrendous mistakes, not only factually, but in judgment and emphasis. But it does mean that we are trying to do it right, and that when we get it wrong, we publish corrections. The goal is to meet the information needs of a democratic society, and the examples would be most traditional news organizations. What can we do about real news? Well, we've seen, especially in the early weeks of the COVID pandemic, that news organizations are laying people off, and newspapers are eliminating print editions. It's a real crisis. And the best thing that I think we can do is to support the news organizations we trust by subscribing to them, or in the case of public media, making donations. Local news is in the midst of an existential crisis, and it's been made much, much worse by the pandemic. Now, a little bit about how not to be that person on Facebook. Before you share a dubious looking story, just ask yourself, is there something that seems a little fishy about this? Does this just seem too good to be true when you're not seeing it anywhere else? See if you can find anything about it at Snopes or another fact-checking site. A lot of times you just enter a few words at Snopes and you'll find out that it is a long debunked fake news story. Check the source. Is it a respected news organization or a site that you've never heard of? Google some keywords to see if other news organizations are reporting the same story. Now, unfortunately, given the times that we live in, too many people think that if no one else is sharing the story, it's because, you know, they're part of the deep state or something and they're suppressing the news. But I think that if you can avoid thinking in those conspiratorial ways, you will know that if there's a big story out there, it may begin with one news organization, but it's going to quickly spread to many other news organizations. I've just put together a very short list of news organizations that I think are worthy of your support. I could go on, but these are certainly the main ones. Actually, I'm going to tell you a story that I just love. A couple of years ago, I was giving a talk, and a guy got up and started saying how much he hated the Washington Post because it's so liberal and it's so biased. And he was a conservative, and he really tapped into real sources of information. And I think that I and other people in the audience are thinking, okay, pretty soon he's going to tell us what he's seeing on Sean Hannity. And no, he didn't. He said he got his news from the Wall Street Journal, still one of our great newspapers, and the Christian Science Monitor, which is really an underappreciated resource. It's gotten awfully small, which is too bad, but the quality is still very high. And I just came away from that feeling really optimistic that here was somebody who talked about how much he despised the mainstream liberal media, and yet he had found alternative sources of news and information that were actually very reliable. And I wish that that happened more often. Now, I also think that it's important to recognize that there are people who simply can't afford to pay for news. And I think that with what's going on now with the pandemic, we have a lot more people who hopefully are just temporarily unable to pay for news or a lot of other things. So I think it's important to keep in mind that even though our leading newspapers especially are now all behind a paywall these days, there is still plenty of sources of high quality free news that's going to remain free. They're looking for donations, they're looking for memberships, but the fact is you can access any of these sources of news without having to pay for them. And yes, I put the evening network newscasts in there because you can sit down in the evening and watch cable news. And I am not a fan of cable news, although I think that Fox News is the bottom of the barrel. I'm not crazy about CNN or MSNBC either. It basically, I think they are trying to stir up controversy and keep you angry so you won't touch that dial. But I think that the three evening network newscasts are a little bit superficial, but nevertheless a lot better than what you'll find on cable news. Now, here I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the challenges that we face today. We all know, I talked about what fake news meant in the fall of 2016. Well, as soon as Donald Trump became president, he began referring to any news story that was critical of him as fake news. And so the meaning has completely shifted. And today, we're really facing a very difficult environment in which a majority of the public, not a huge majority, but a majority, believes that the mainstream media are dedicated to telling the truth. And for the most part, they trust what they see there. And then we have a minority of the public who really do look to President Trump as pretty much the source of all truth. And it makes it very difficult to penetrate the wall that they have put around themselves. By the way, you could say that, well, liberals have a wall around themselves too, and they do to some extent. There's no question about that. But there have been studies done. There was a very well done study a few years ago by MIT and Harvard that showed that the bubbles, the media bubbles that liberals erect around themselves are much more permeable and diverse than the media bubbles that conservatives have erected around themselves. And it's hard to know how to pierce that. As I said, the president really has instructed his followers that he is the one source of truthful information. Media distrust is misunderstood, and I really want to emphasize that. We often hear that people don't trust the media, and broadly speaking, that's true. But when you drill down a little bit, you find that people trust the media that they use, and they don't trust media in a broader and more generic sense. And many Trump supporters disregard mainstream reporting as fake news. So let's look at a chart here from the Pew Research Center. Here you see that people who said they were Democrats or leaning Democratic trusted a variety of mainstream news organizations. It's interesting that we're just seeing television here, but this is where they lean. The Republicans overwhelmingly with Fox News. Now, if you ask, how did we get to this point where people will tell you that they distrust the media, even though they do trust the media that they rely on every day? I would look at the explosion of different media outlets, each of them catering to a different ideological or partisan point of view. When I was a kid, many, many years ago, There were 3 network newscasts that were all largely the same. You could probably get one large newspaper delivered to your house, in most cases the Globe, and probably a local paper. A lot of people got Time or Newsweek, which were basically the same. So the media didn't just reflect, but also helped form a sense of unity in the country. And there were good things about that and bad things about that. But nevertheless, it was a reality. And today, anybody can go check out whatever media source speaks to them. And that's why we see this incredible hyperpartisanship today. Now, I want to give you a few examples of what I call the consequences of epistemic disclosure, epistemic closure. I would argue that certain elements of the right, certainly the Trump right, are living in a world defined by epistemic closure. That means you simply cannot penetrate their worldview. It really doesn't matter. We begin with the way that Donald Trump launched his political career, and it was by challenging whether Barack Obama had been born in the United States, long before Obama had been elected president. And Trump was one of the people who really pushed on this. And Obama eventually felt compelled to produce his birth certificate. And it didn't matter. It was obviously a fake. It's not true. It's fake news. Another example. This is the truthers from Newtown, Connecticut, and other mass shootings. And you see, and I think that you probably know and have read about or have seen on TV, this horrible, horrible campaign conducted by Alex Jones and others to claim that these shootings in Sandy Hook, as well as some other shootings, were fakes carried out by crisis actors in order to give the government the wherewithal to take away their guns. This is just really vile stuff. Now we get up to what we're going through now. A friend of mine who is a nurse posted this on Facebook recently. And you can see the headline. You don't really have to read the story. The headline tells the story. U.S. hospitals getting paid more to label cause of death as coronavirus. So naturally, that means that the government is claiming there were many more cases of COVID-19 than there really are, and it's no worse than the flu, and yada, yada, yada. Now, Facebook automatically will tag outside content and tell you a little bit about where it's coming from. And this was from globalresearch.ca. So if you clicked on the I, here is what you'd get. Recently shared false news. It's run by a Canadian economist, author, and conspiracy theorist. This is all really bad stuff. This is a completely unreliable source of information. And Facebook did make some attempt at warning people of that. But my friend posted this. She probably never clicked on that I. If she did, she probably would have said, well, that's the deep state. And there you go. The idea that COVID-19 really isn't that big a deal ended up getting yet another boost on social media. And, this brings us right up to President Trump urging people to, I forget whether it was drink bleach or inject it. I wouldn't want to get that wrong. But he was talking about somehow getting light inside the body and drinking bleach. And I don't know what he was talking about. But we know that it resulted in uh, tons of calls from people wondering whether they should drink bleach in order to prevent themselves from getting COVID-19. So can trust be restored in this kind of environment? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? And that brings me to the end of the presentation I wanted to do. And at this point, I'd really like to just have a conversation with you for as long as you would like. So I'm going to
Okay,
open that back up, and now I can see people again.
there you go. We did have one question. There was some confusion about your differentiation between fake news and false news. Could you?
That's a good question, and I tried to say, probably not very um, well, that I think the distinction, which I had tried to make at one time, has largely broken down. I originally thought that fake news was something maybe we could do something about because it was simply aimed at gaming Facebook and Google's algorithms and making a little bit of ad money. And if you took away their ad money, if you could identify known purveyors of fake news, took away their ad money, they would lose their incentive to do this because they were only in it for the money. And false news, at least in my original formulation, was really this kind of weaponized political propaganda aimed at influencing the public discourse. And I don't really think that there's anything that we can or should do about that except to try to fight back with good information. I do think that in retrospect, the two categories have kind of begun to collapse into each other, and that even during the 2016 campaign, a lot of what we thought of as fake news produced by kids in Macedonia was really being funded and supported by the Russians with an aim toward a particular result. So I'm sorry I didn't make that distinction particularly clear. I don't know that I think the distinction is as useful as it was a few years ago when I first started talking about it.
Thank you, Dan. Mary Sue, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Can you hear me on that, please?
Yes, we can.
Very well.
Okay, good. So there's a lot of work going on these days in the field of artificial intelligence, which enables technology to imitate voices of actual people. The most notable example that's recent is, and it was supported by Time magazine, is there's an exhibition on the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King at a Smithsonian Institute, at a Smithsonian affiliate, in Chicago, the DuSable Museum of African American History. And if in that museum, the virtual reality offers the experience of listening to King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And that's a good example of this technology. But in 2017, the BBC reported that artificial intelligence was being used to manipulate the image and speeches of former President Obama. And it seems that this technology could quite easily be used to produce fake news. Can you comment on these recent developments?
Oh, sure, absolutely. What you're talking about is often referred to as deep fakes, and they're very sophisticated. And I've seen a deep fake done with former President Obama with his permission. It was a way of educating people to show how deceptive these things can be. And it's certainly something that we need to keep an eye on. But what's really interesting about this is that we are finding that what you might call shallow fakes are that anybody can make and are crude and easily proven to be fake, are nevertheless continue to have an influence. There was one a couple of months ago where somebody slowed down Nancy Pelosi's talk and made it appear that she was drunk and slurring her words. And there was nothing sophisticated about it. And yet it had its effect. And there have been a number of other examples of that, but that's the most prominent one that comes to mind at the moment. I do think that the technology that you're talking about, Mary Sue, is very much something we have to keep an eye on. But I would also suggest that this stuff really doesn't have to be that sophisticated in order to have an effect. This has happened a number of times recently with Joe Biden. A number of manipulated videos that make it look like he's has dementia or something. And I find it interesting that you keep hearing this claim from the right that Biden has dementia, and yet every example they put out there turns out to have been manipulated. Well, if he really did have dementia, they wouldn't have to manipulate it, would they?
Dan,
Thanks.
Ingrid has a question here. She says, and I think this is a question we would all love to have some of your input on. What do we do to crack through epistemic closure?
All I can say is I think we're living through a very dark period in our history. I don't know. And Lord knows I don't want to see the pandemic get any worse. But the pandemic carries with it certain realities. And you do wonder if at a certain point, there were some people who have believed a lot of the nonsense that they're being told, begin to realize that we haven't been told the truth about COVID-19, and maybe we haven't been told the truth about a lot of other things. We've seen these liberate protests in front of state houses. We had one in Boston just yesterday. And I must say, not very many people come to those things. So you're talking about the most out there of the hardcore. And maybe people who like President Trump, like a lot of what he's done, like what they hear, but aren't necessarily looking to him as the source of all truth and all truth and reality. Maybe they can be persuaded that some of what they've been thinking over the last few years is just plain wrong. And it's unfortunate. I mean, we keep, this all sounds very partisan, doesn't it? And yet, the problem is essentially on one side. I think I told Mary Sue a couple of weeks ago, it would be nice if we could get back to the days when you could say, well, Bill Clinton and Bob Dole they have two different philosophies, but they're both good people who are looking out for what's best in the country. Or even Barack Obama and John McCain or Mitt Romney. But that's not the situation that we're living through at the moment. And we really have to acknowledge the reality of that, I think.
Okay, I've got another question here from Laura. We've heard so much about Russian interference in the last election. If the federal government were willing to do something to protect the next election, what could it do?
Well, there are a variety of points of entry that the Russians have tried to explore that that each require a different set of solutions. The one thing that we are reasonably sure did not happen in 2016 is that the Russians didn't actually penetrate voting places. That didn't happen. I think that we can be fairly sure that they would like to try. And so certainly we need voting to be made as secure as we possibly can. And I think that with that, it has to start with a paper trail, which we have in Massachusetts, but we don't have it in every state. I mean, that's one thing. I think that the platforms like Facebook and Twitter have made some attempts to crack down on Russian disinformation campaigns coming onto their platforms. But it's really been left entirely to their own devices, and I don't really know how successful they've been at it. One of the most damaging incidents that took place in 2016 was when WikiLeaks got a hold of the Democratic National Committee's emails and started strategically leaking them out. And I don't know what you do about that, because you try to run a secure operation. In retrospect, we know that the DNC did a terrible job of maintaining security of their servers. By the way, I don't know if you remember, but there really wasn't that much in those emails. I think the reason they were so damaging was that voters who really hadn't been paying that much attention to what was going on had been hearing about nothing but emails for months because of Hillary Clinton's private email server. And so then, when just as the campaign was heating up, there was this other completely different trove of emails that WikiLeaks dumped on everybody. I think a lot of ordinary voters said, more emails. It must be crooked Hillary's fault. And even though it was a completely different story, we did not know at the time, although I think some people had their suspicions, that it looks like WikiLeaks was very much in league with Russia during that time. And we also know that there's quite a bit of evidence that Roger Stone, one of Donald Trump's political gurus, may have very well have been in touch with WikiLeaks. So, you know, you've got one of the things that we might do to protect ourselves from the Russians is to have our presidential candidates understand the importance of maintaining the integrity of our elections, rather than, you know, nodding and winking at people like Roger Stone. By the way, have you ever seen the Netflix documentary Get Me, Roger Stone? You have to see it. It is, I've seen it twice. It is an amazing piece of work.
Okay. Ladies here on the panel, what questions do you have for Dan? You can unmute yourselves. Go ahead, Diana.
Yeah. Dan, a lot of newspapers and organizations like Snopes do a lot of fact checking. And you also see some of the networks calling out a lie when it's a lie, which they didn't used to do. And which seems like a good thing, but I've seen some media experts claim that every time there's a fact check on a lie, in effect, it's reinforcing the lie, even though it's showing the falsity of the original claim. What's your view of that?
It's a very, very complicated issue. Some media observers who I really respect, such as probably one of my favorites is Margaret Sullivan, who writes the media column for the Washington Post, will write from time to time that what the media really needs to do is to be even more direct about calling out President Trump's lies. And it just seems like a never-ending cycle of, what the way that you could almost characterize it is, well, it must be that we're not yelling loud enough. Well, they're really not that we're not yelling loud enough. There's a media theorist, a communications theorist named James W. Carey, who's written about how media affects people in a very deep way. And he has written that journalism really serves two completely different functions. One of them is to inform the public. That's what we tend to think of as the sole purpose of journalism. It's to inform the public. It's to provide us with the information we need to govern ourselves in a democratic society. What else could it be? Well, he argues that there's also a ritual aspect to journalism. And the ritual aspect is to reinforce the norms and beliefs of a particular community. And I think that one of the challenges that we're dealing with is that the fact checks that you talk about, Margaret Sullivan's call to we need to yell louder, all these things work not just on an informational level, but also on a ritual level. And on the ritual level, they are reinforcing the sense that many people have that, in fact, President Trump is a profligate liar. But I think that the fact checks also work on a ritual level in signaling to President Trump's supporters that the fake news media is not to be trusted. And here's another example of it. And they hate us and they hold us in contempt and they think we're deplorables and all that. So it works with the people who already are inclined that way, but it doesn't really change any minds. Now, there's also a concept known as a truth sandwich that is kind of interesting. And people have been urged, the media have been urged to use a truth sandwich when reporting dangerous falsehoods, whether it's from President Trump or anybody else. And that is, you tell your audience what the truth is, then you report what the falsehood was, and then you repeat what the truth is. And there's some evidence that that does have some effect on people. And I think certainly it's a good practice that we ought to keep in mind. The Pulitzer Prizes were announced yesterday. And the Washington Post won a big Pulitzer for a 10-part series on climate change. And they put this incredible amount of effort into it. It used all these data mining techniques to show where the hottest places in the world are, the effects in terms of extreme temperatures, droughts, floods, you name it. Just incredibly good journalism. And I was looking it over, and one of the things that occurred to me was, whose mind is going to be changed by this? Whose mind is going to be changed by this? This is terrific reinforcement for people who are already engaged with the fact-based media. But people who tell themselves that climate change isn't real or isn't anything to be worried about, they are not going to change their minds fundamentally. And it's a real problem. By the way, you began by mentioning Snopes. Snopes had some sort of a personnel problem a year ago, I think. And naturally, it was to people who don't like Snopes, it was used to discredit Snopes. You try to cite Snopes now and you get, Snopes? You can't believe Snopes. That happened with the Southern Christian Leadership council within the last couple of years. They had some genuine personnel problems at the top, and the founder, I'm forgetting his name, he ended up having to leave. And they've gotten their act back together, and they continue to be the leading reliable source of information on domestic terrorist groups in the United States. But now you try to cite them and you immediately get, oh, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. What are you paying attention to them for? So this is the world we live in.
I have a question here from Catherine. Do you believe a revival of the fairness doctrine will help end partisan news on cable especially?
No. I'm pretty much a First Amendment absolutist, and I do not lament the death of the fairness doctrine. The problem with the abolition of the fairness doctrine is that it was accompanied by removal of all meaningful restrictions on the number of radio and TV stations that you could own. So it always seemed to me that if you could ensure diversity of ownership, then you could, not worry about the content. But unfortunately, we have just a few major corporations owning all the broadcast outlets, and so the role of right-wing radio talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh ends up being amplified because of this monopolization. So no, I'm not a fan of that. And in terms of cable news, the only reason that the fairness doctrine was considered constitutional was that it was an attempt to deal with what was regarded as a scarce, publicly owned resource, and that is the public airways. There's only so much bandwidth. You can only have so many stations. And so therefore, the theory was that you could regulate these in the public interest. There's no scarcity with cable. So there's no constitutional rationale for regulating the content of cable. And cable itself is kind of a transitional technology at this point, right? I mean, we'll be getting all of our video programming via the internet in a few years. And that isn't just not scarce, it's infinite and ultimately unregulatable. So I understand where you're coming from, but I just don't think that there's much way of dealing with that.
Okay. I have a question here from Mary Sue. In this pandemic with the stay-at-home orders, increasing or decreasing, is the pandemic with the stay-at-home orders increasing or decreasing the quest for news in depth versus fake or false news?
Well, let's go back a little bit. I think that the election of President Trump resulted in a tremendous increase in interest in real news. That's when we saw news organizations that charge for digital subscriptions really begin to attain success. The New York Times and the Washington Post, but locally the Boston Globe has done quite well with getting people to pay for digital subscriptions. Donations to NPR went way up. Listenership went way up. So there was this tremendous interest in reliable news about the new Trump administration, and that has stayed with us to this day. Of course, that does not penetrate the minority of people who look to President Trump as their primary source of news and information. I think that the pandemic plays into that. I would see it as kind of a related phenomenon rather than as something completely different. One thing I have seen is that even though the pandemic overnight wiped out a lot of the sources of revenue that news organizations had, nevertheless, audience engagement went through the roof. But my understanding is that that fell off rather quickly. And I kind of wonder if, I mean, the pandemic is going to be the number one story we're dealing with for quite a while. But still, I wonder if in the long run, it's especially good practice to make almost your entire news report about the pandemic. I mean, if you made it 30% of your news report, that would still be more than anything else, but it would be a lot less than we're getting at the moment.
Mhm. Okay. Karen, did you have a question?
Yes. There are many news sources outside the US that are not familiar to us regarding their reputation. Are there any resources that we can turn to vet international news?
That's a really good question. You know, we know that there are a lot of great news sources internationally, and you know, certainly we're most familiar with the UK because it's in English, right? So we know that the Guardian and the BBC are very good. um, I'm sorry. I hope I don't have COVID. No, this is just spring allergies. Um, as far as a guide to what's reliable and what isn't internationally, I don't really know. I mean, we all know that there are some brands out there that are good. I mean, Le Monde in France, Haaretz in Israel. Russia Today went from good to bad over the years. So I don't know.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have run over time. And I just want to say on behalf of the league and especially on behalf of this lady, Dan, thank you so very much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful evening. I thank you for spending it with us.
Well, thank you. I
Thank you.
enjoyed doing it. And oh, there's Mary Sue.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you for having me, and I hope that the audience was able to get something out of it. I don't want to force you to go overtime, but I see there's still a few questions. We could continue
Well,
if you wanted to.
Okay. Joan Garnis says, is it reasonably safe to rely on such as the New York Times and Washington Post as reliable sources of real news?
Well, I mean, I think so. I think so. I think that they are about as good as it gets. They have the one thing that I would caution about with both of them is that they have benefited enormously from um, an audience that is anti-Trump. And I think that they have to caution against catering to that constituency. And I think the Post sometimes, in particular the Post, sometimes gets a little bit carried away. But I think that they're about as reliable as it gets.
Okay, and one final question. Diane Bigelow asks for some clarification. Dan just said that what should be done is state the truth, tell the lie, and then tell the truth. And that's what I'm asking about. Why isn't this being done everywhere? How do we know it doesn't change a person's mind?
Yeah, you know, it's too bad that it's not being done everywhere. And you probably know that there was a lot of controversy over running President Trump's COVID news conferences live and unedited and giving him an opportunity to put all kinds of false information out there. I think that when he went on with the bleach, that ended up ending that, and we haven't seen as much of it since then. You know, the reason that we don't see that much of it is that the news media are a very flawed institution, and I think that most news organizations try to do the best they can, but they also see themselves as a business. They're pursuing audience and ratings. And unfortunately, I think that does sometimes get in the way of doing their job as well as they could.
Okay. And one final question for Miliana. What about Vox, Axios, and Politico?
Got an hour?
Huffington, throw in Huffington Post.
Yeah. You know what? I think they're okay. Let me just give the very short answer. I think they're all pretty reliable. I think they're good news organizations trying to do a good job. My beef with Politico is that they wallow in covering politics as if it were a sporting event, which I don't think does a service to democracy. But, you know, it's certainly accurate and dedicated to reporting the truth. Axios, you may know, grew out of Politico. Some of the founders of Politico realized that they had neglected to get an ownership share. So they said, we're going to leave and start something new, and this time we'll be the owners. But you know, they do a pretty good job. And Vox is kind of interesting. They are dedicated solely to explanatory journalism. And I think that the criticism of Vox, and I try to look at this as objectively as I can because I'm a liberal myself, but I think the criticism of Vox is that it is just really relentlessly liberal in a way that doesn't really acknowledge any other reality. But, you know, the quality's pretty good.
Okay. Well, again, Dan, thank you so very much. To my panelists, thank you very much. And to all the attendees, we appreciate your being here. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Be safe.
Thank you. You too. You take care and stay healthy, everybody.
Thank you very much,
Bye,
Dan.
Dan.
Really great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.